starting out your color wheel painting, you need to get your newspaper ready. So take one piece of newspaper, fold it up, and then you're going to be getting your paint. All that we're going to be using is red, yellow, and blue, and then we'll have black and white. Mainly primary colors you can mix any color with. Black and white will be to make your shades and tints. Once you have your paint, you get your plastic wrap. This is something that you'll use to help preserve your paint throughout the project. And so you'll notice that every time I put the plastic wrap over it, then I kind of tap gently around it so that no air can get to the paint. This prevents it from drying out so that you can continue to reuse it throughout your project. Supplies that you need, so you have your paint. I have a paintbrush. I like ones that are a little bit springier. A little bit of water, paper towel, and obviously your project should be drawn out. And then you are ready to begin. So you'll gently peel back the plastic wrap. Make sure that you keep the paint side up because then you can reuse it. All right, and then I like to start out using just a primary color because then I don't have to do any mixing. Keeps it simple just to get that start. Now, notice how I carefully paint throughout the entire section that I have labeled with the P, which is for pure color, all right? And then you just mix just a little bit of paint at a time. You really shouldn't be mixing more than like a dime's amount of paint at a time, just because with the size of our projects, you really don't need more paint than that. So you'll see kind of how I do that, and then just adding just a little bit of black at a time. So I make sure that I have that shade. I will paint it, and between every single tint and pure color and shade, I always make sure that I'm rinsing out my brush, just because then you don't get any tones, you don't get any messed up colors, anything like that. You'll notice here that I end up just painting over the waves. That's because I know that with my red, if I'm painting it at a nice and thin, even coat, that I'm actually going to be able to see those paint lines through there. So I don't need to keep those as a guide. Now, if you are unsure, it's best just to paint around. But then you can see that I can make my tint for my red, and then I will now have a tint for my mountaintop, and then I'll be able to do tints for my waves since that's how I have them labeled. And then in my red section, I have a couple different shades there, and I have tints as well. Now for this project, I also like to skip a section between and try to avoid painting right next to other wet paint areas. That helps prevent any mixing of colors accidentally, and just keeps your colors much cleaner. Now you'll find with yellow that you're going to be needing to do multiple coats, and so I kind of do that throughout this video of going back and painting over, because the pencil lines show through a lot. Now if you're doing tints and shades, you're usually okay, but that pure color, it takes a couple coats. So you need to make sure that you're letting it dry in between. And a lot of the colors, just in general, it's good to go back over with at least a second coat. Just it makes it a little bit more solid, a little bit more high quality, and then in general, just makes it look neater. Now, once I have my pure color with no mixing, so my primary colors, I have those completed. I kind of rinse out my brush, making sure that I'm pressing it down so I don't have any paint left on my brush. Then I go back in and do any touch-ups. It doesn't take long if you're painting with thin coats. It doesn't take long for it to dry, so I'm able to go back in and add another coat of that tint because I can see that it's not quite thick enough. It doesn't really stand out, which makes it a not very great tint. So I go back in, I make some touch-ups on that. If I have that leftover shade, I can go back in and do another coat for that as well. Just making sure that everything is nice and even and it's not too thin. And that's something you want to make sure you're doing for each section. If you're doing this project properly, you should be taking multiple days. So in between days, this is kind of the process that you're going to be needing to do for cleanup. You can see how I carefully put that plastic wrap over my colors and make sure that everything matches up so that my colors don't get changed. And then all that paint will be saved as well. Now, any thin areas, those are going to dry out overnight, but I can use those as a basis for matching too. Now for coloring or cleaning your brushes, you're gonna rinse out those water cups, get any paint out of your brush as much as possible. Use a little bit of soap. You press the brush into your palm, kind of make sure you scrub it really good, rinse it out. And then you actually wanna make sure that you're testing it on your arm. And if there's any color, then you need to make sure you rewash it. For washing your tables, I always add a little bit of water and I just kind of scrub that paint off, and then you go back in with a dry paper towel and you just wipe it up, and that should be all that it takes. And if you're doing this regularly, it should stay nice and clean. Now the next day that you get to start to paint, you get all your materials again, and then you just peel back that paint again. Now if you did this properly, your paint should all be clean and ready to go for you again. Sometimes the newspaper sticks and you get some dry spots, but that's okay. You can always work with it still. You can see that the first thing that I do is go for that yellow and get that nice second coat on there. Just trying to make sure I'm covering up all those pencil lines, making sure it looks quality. And you can go through and do that with any of the colors from before, just because it's usually just little touch-ups here and there. Now for mixing any of your secondary colors, so orange, purple, or green, you always start with the lighter color and then add the darker color in from there. It's a lot easier to mix, and you can see that I'm really not mixing a lot of paint, but I started with that yellow and added a little bit of red in order to make orange. So you always think back to that color wheel of whatever colors in between the two primary colors is the color that you're using to make that. Now you can kind of see how I organize my paint there a little bit. I have the main part mixed, and then I use that little bit. I put some on the side or on each side, and then I make one of them a tint, and then I will make one of them a shade. Same thing as mixing orange. I start with that yellow and add a little bit of blue. It really doesn't take a ton of those darker colors to make those colors. So make sure that you are doing a gradual mixing of them. Now keep in mind, if you ever make a color that you don't like, or it doesn't work, or it's not dark enough, or it's not light enough, you always just let your paint dry, and then you can always go back in and paint over it. If your paint is still wet, all you're doing is just going to be mixing in the paint, and it's not going to actually really change your paint a whole lot. So just keep that in mind, let it dry, and then go back in and do touch-ups. And a lot of times, depending on the time of day, you can actually get your paint touched up before the end of class if you get it done early enough. So otherwise, you always have the next class. Now, violet's probably the one that most people struggle with because a lot of times it kind of looks more like a maroon or it looks too blue. So you really want to do your best to just make sure that it doesn't look red or it doesn't look blue. It should look somewhere in between there. All right, once you add that white in there and becomes a tint, it actually looks a little bit more violet. Now, shades, I know in the video it's kind of actually tough to tell that it's a shade, but it is. And I can tell in person, you should be able to tell in person the difference between the pure violet as well as your shade of violet. The tints are definitely the easiest to tell the difference of. So now my paint is all sealed up. My project is finished. So I have a pure shade and tint in every section. I have my red, I have my orange, I have my yellow, I have my green, I have my blue, and I have my violet. So make sure that you're going through double checking each section has its pure shade and tint. If you're missing something, make sure to go back in and check with that. And also make sure that everything flows together. So like you can see, all my waves are all tints, so everything flows. Good luck.